Hi, church. What have you celebrated recently? A birthday? An anniversary? Maybe a new job? In our text today, we find the apostles celebrating what seems at first a rather unusual reason. The text says the apostles left the Sanhedrin, rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Day after day in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. Can you believe that? They were rejoicing that they were worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. In the verse preceding this section, we're told that the Sanhedrin had warned them against sharing the good news and then had them flogged, which likely meant receiving the 40 lashes minus one. Their backs would have been lacerated and bloody. And yet, as painful as this was, the punishment was not specifically about pain. More than that, it was intended as a public humiliation. They were treated as criminals for proclaiming the gospel. In John Stott's commentary on this passage, he says, he refers to this as a beautiful antithesis: the honor to be dishonored, the grace to be disgraced. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had said, "Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." These aren't just impressive, like stained glass words. The disciples were now experiencing this as their reality. The Spirit within them was bubbling up, leading them to rejoice. Now, the fact that the three main leaders in the early church, Peter and Paul and James, they each speak in their own writings about the necessity to rejoice in suffering. It points to the universality of the experience. That is, all in the early church experienced this reality of suffering for their faith. But also points to our temptation to give up, to lash out, to despair in our suffering. And what we find in this text is rejoicing and perseverance. Now, here's what strikes me about this passage. I can't speak to the experience of being persecuted for my faith. I do believe that there's a growing anti-Christian sentiment in our culture, particularly amongst wealthy, highly educated, and politically progressive. But I'm not going to put that in the same ballpark with what so many Christians have faced throughout church history, or even what's currently experienced by our Christian brothers and sisters in places like North Korea, Afghanistan, and Somalia. What I do know is that when I feel like someone has wronged me, it's so easy to get angry and take offense. It's so easy to resent them and make the perpetrator of that wrong an enemy. Now, how easy would it have been for the apostles to respond to the Sanhedrin with disdain, to paint them as the enemy? It's clear they didn't. In verse 7 of the next chapter, Luke tells us, "So the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith." Those priests would have been a part of the very Sanhedrin that had them beaten and disgraced. They didn't see them as enemies, but as a mission field. They saw them as objects of God's love to be redeemed, not enemies to be destroyed. Okay, maybe they saw them as enemies. They just took Jesus' word seriously when he commands us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's possible that we will see anti-Christian sentiment continue to rise in our country as it becomes progressively secular. In light of that, we should consider the Apostle Paul's words in Ephesians, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." And we have to be careful that in making the mission field the battlefield, that we're not taking aim at those that Christ came to deliver. May our response be one of love to those who've wronged us, and that then we turn our attention to rejoicing that in our suffering we get to identify with the one who suffered and died for us. Have a blessed week, church.